Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My name is Daniel Hale. I'm a senior field analyst with the Ararat Group, an independent team of experts in biblical archaeology, funded by a network of anonymous benefactors from various theological institutions. We operate under strict confidentiality, often asked to investigate claims too controversial for public universities or mainstream media. What I'm about to tell you will likely never see the light of day. If you're reading this, it means I've either disappeared or worse. I need someone to know what we found beneath the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth. I need someone to understand why some discoveries should remain buried forever. The call came at 3:47 in the morning on a Wednesday in early spring. I was deep in sleep at my apartment in Boston when my encrypted phone buzzed against the nightstand. The caller ID showed only a series of numbers I recognized as belonging to our network of contacts in the Holy Land. The voice on the other end belonged to Father Antonio Benedetti, a Franciscan archivist I'd worked with twice before on sensitive matters. His Italian accent was usually warm and measured, but tonight it carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before. "Daniel, forgive the hour, but we have an emergency," he said, his words coming in rapid bursts. "The earthquake last week. It opened something beneath our church. Something that should not exist, according to everything we know about this site." I sat up instantly, the familiar adrenaline of a new discovery flooding my system. The Ararat Group didn't get called for routine archaeological finds. We specialized in the impossible, the controversial, the discoveries that could shake the foundations of organized religion. "What exactly did you find, Father?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of his labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "A tomb, Daniel. First-century Jewish burial site, completely intact. The preservation is unlike anything I've seen in 40 years of studying this region, but that's not why I'm calling you at this ungodly hour." I waited, knowing that Father Antonio was not one for dramatics. If he was this shaken, whatever they discovered was significant. The central ossuary bears an inscription in Aramaic, Yeshua bar Yosef. Jesus, son of Joseph. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The name wasn't uncommon in first-century Judea. Historians agreed on that. But the implications of finding such an inscription beneath one of Christianity's holiest sites were staggering. "Father, you know that name appears on ossuaries throughout the region. The Talpiot tomb in 1980 had several—" "Daniel," he interrupted, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. "There's more. Alongside the Aramaic inscription, there's text in Koine Greek, etched hastily, as if someone was working in desperate haste or fear. The translation is clear. He will rise again." My mouth went dry. This wasn't just another archaeological curiosity. This was potentially earth-shattering evidence that could rewrite 2,000 years of Christian history. "And there's something else," Father Antonio continued, "something I can barely bring myself to say aloud. Below the main inscription, carved so faintly we almost missed it, are additional words in Greek. They bound him here." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If this ossuary was authentic, if it truly contained the remains of Jesus of Nazareth, then everything Christianity taught about the resurrection was built on a lie. But worse than that, the additional inscription suggested something far more sinister than a simple cover-up. "I've already contacted Director Coleman," Father Antonio said. "He's arranging immediate transport for you and a senior analyst. This discovery cannot become public knowledge until we understand what we're dealing with. Within 6 hours, I was at Logan International Airport with my mentor and partner, Elias North. Elias was in his early 60s with silver hair that had turned white at the temples, and the kind of weathered, sun-damaged face that spoke of decades spent in desert excavations across the Middle East. He'd been with the Ararat Group since its inception in 1987, and there wasn't a biblical mystery or archaeological controversy he hadn't encountered. As our El Al flight climbed through the grey Boston sky, I studied his expression. Elias had seen it all. Fraudulent relics, genuine artifacts that challenged accepted history, discoveries that had been buried by religious authorities to protect the faithful from uncomfortable truths. But today, he looked genuinely troubled. "What do you think we're walking into?" I asked him as we levelled off over the Atlantic. Elias stared out the small window at the endless expanse of ocean below. For a long moment he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "In 34 years of doing this work, Daniel, I've learned that the most dangerous discoveries are the ones that threaten the fundamental beliefs people build their lives around. If what Father Antonio described is authentic, we're not just dealing with an archaeological find. We're dealing with something that could destroy the faith of 2 billion Christians worldwide." He turned to look at me directly, his pale blue eyes intense with concern. "But more than that, I think we're walking into something the church has kept hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Something they're terrified to acknowledge, even to themselves." The flight to Tel Aviv took 11 hours, giving me plenty of time to research the Church of the Annunciation and its history. Built over the traditional site where Christians believed the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she would bear the Son of God, the church had been a pilgrimage destination for centuries. The current basilica, completed in 1969, was built over the ruins of previous churches dating back to the Byzantine period. But what interested me most were the older archaeological reports. Excavations in the 1950s had revealed extensive cave systems beneath the church, some of which showed evidence of first-century habitation. The official reports described these as typical domestic caves of the period, possibly including the home of the Holy Family. What the reports didn't mention, but what I found in classified church archives through our secured database, were references to sealed chambers that had never been fully explored. Chambers that the Vatican had declared off limits to further investigation. We landed in Tel Aviv on Thursday morning, March 15th, under overcast skies that seemed to mirror the gravity of our mission. The drive to Nazareth took us through the ancient landscape of Galilee, past olive groves and limestone hills that had remained virtually unchanged since the time of Christ. Father Antonio met us at the entrance to the Church of the Annunciation, and I was struck immediately by how much he had aged since our last meeting 2 years earlier. His usually immaculate appearance was dishevelled, his clerical collar slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Thank God you're here," he said, embracing us both with unusual emotion. "I haven't slept properly since we made the discovery. The implications of what lies beneath our feet, it's been consuming my thoughts day and night." He led us through the magnificent basilica, past groups of pilgrims from around the world who knelt in prayer before the ornate altars, completely unaware of what had been discovered just meters below. The church was a masterpiece of modern religious architecture, its soaring concrete arches and beautiful mosaics creating an atmosphere of reverence and awe. "The public knows nothing of this," Father Antonio explained as we walked. "We've told the municipal authorities it's routine maintenance work on the lower grotto systems. The Israeli Antiquities Authority has been informed that we're conducting standard conservation work on the Byzantine remains." We descended through areas of the church I'd never seen before, past the public grottos where pilgrims came to pray, down stone staircases that grew progressively older and more primitive. The walls changed from modern concrete to medieval stone to Roman construction, and finally to rough-hewn limestone that predated the birth of Christianity. The earthquake last Tuesday night was minor by Israeli standards, Father Antonio explained as we walked. Magnitude 3.8, centered about 12 kilometers northeast of here. But it was enough to crack the wall here in this lower chamber. We had reached the deepest level of the church complex, a chamber carved directly from the living rock. The air was noticeably cooler here, carrying the faint scent of ancient incense and something else, something organic and unsettling that I couldn't identify. Father Antonio pointed to a jagged crack in the limestone wall, about 3 feet high and barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Our maintenance supervisor, Giuseppe, discovered it the morning after the earthquake. When he shined his flashlight inside, he saw what appeared to be carved burial niches. We squeezed through the opening, one by one, our powerful LED flashlights cutting through darkness that had remained undisturbed for centuries. What we found on the other side defied every expectation I had formed during the flight from Boston. The tomb complex was far more extensive than Father Antonio had described. A central chamber, roughly circular and about 12 feet in diameter, opened into 6 smaller burial chambers, arranged like the petals of a flower. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, even by the high standards of first-century Jewish stone carvers. Every surface was smooth, every angle perfectly calculated, but it was the orientation that immediately caught Elias's attention. "This is all wrong," he muttered, running his weathered hands along the limestone walls. Jewish tombs from this period always faced Jerusalem. The deceased were positioned so they could rise toward the holy city when the Messiah came to resurrect the dead. He was right. I pulled out my compass and confirmed what my instincts had already told me. The tomb faced due east, but slightly off-center, as if to deliberately avoid the direction of the Temple Mount. "It's not just facing away from Jerusalem," I said, studying the readings. "It's positioned to reject it entirely. Whoever carved this tomb was making a statement." In the central chamber, positioned on a stone shelf, carved with unusual care, sat the ossuary that had prompted our urgent journey. It was larger than typical bone boxes from the period, carved from a single piece of limestone with decorative elements I'd never seen on Jewish burial containers. The Aramaic inscription was clear and professionally carved, Yeshua bar Yosef, but it was the Greek text that made my hands shake as I photographed it from every angle. The letters were carved hastily, with less skill than the Aramaic, as if someone had been working in desperate haste or under extreme stress. The translation was unmistakable. "He will rise again." But as I examined the ossuary more closely, I found the third inscription Father Antonio had mentioned, carved so faintly in the limestone that it was barely visible, even under our powerful lights. Below the main text, in letters that seemed to have been scratched rather than properly carved, were the words, "They bound him here." "My God," whispered Elias, leaning close to examine the inscription. "Daniel, do you understand what this suggests?" I did, and it terrified me. If this ossuary was authentic, if it truly contained the remains of Jesus of Nazareth, then the foundational story of Christianity was built on a deception. But the hastily carved Greek text and the barely visible binding inscription suggested something far more horrifying than a simple lie about resurrection. They suggested that Jesus hadn't died on the cross at all. They suggested he had been buried alive. We worked through the rest of Thursday and all day Friday, documenting every detail of the tomb complex. I photographed the inscriptions from dozens of angles, measured and sketched the chamber layouts, and collected small samples of the limestone for later analysis. Elias focused on the other burial niches, all of which were empty except for traces of ancient oils and spices. "This wasn't a family tomb," he observed on Friday evening as we reviewed our notes back at the hotel. "Family tombs from this period typically contain multiple generations of burials. But here, only the central ossuary shows any evidence of use. What does that tell you? It tells me this tomb was carved for a specific purpose, for a specific individual, someone important enough to warrant this level of craftsmanship, and someone controversial enough to require burial away from traditional Jewish sites. Saturday morning, we returned to open the ossuary itself. Father Antonio had arranged for a conservation specialist from the Israel Museum to be present, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ruth Goldberg, who had worked on some of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the country. "The preservation is remarkable," she observed, as we carefully lifted the heavy limestone lid. "The limestone has protected the contents from moisture and environmental damage. Whatever is inside should be in excellent condition." What we found confirmed our worst fears and added new layers of horror to an already nightmarish discovery. Inside lay the complete skeletal remains of an adult male, approximately 5 feet 8 in height, aged between 30 and 35 at the time of death. Dr. Goldberg's preliminary examination confirmed that the bones dated to the correct period, roughly 30 to 60 AD. But it was the evidence of trauma that made our discovery truly chilling. The skeleton showed unmistakable signs of crucifixion. The wrists bore the distinctive marks of nail wounds, positioned exactly where Roman executioners would have driven the spikes to support the body's weight. There was evidence of severe trauma to the ribs on the right side, consistent with a spear thrust between the 5th and 6th ribs. But strangest of all, we found a collection of iron nails bundled together beside the bones, wrapped in decayed fabric that might once have been linen. The nails were roughly the right size and shape to have been used in a crucifixion, and they showed traces of what appeared to be dried blood. "Only one other crucified skeleton has ever been found in Israel," I said to Elias as we examined the remains. "Jehohanan, discovered in 1968 in a tomb north of Jerusalem. This would be only the second confirmed victim of Roman crucifixion ever discovered by archaeologists." But Elias was focused on something else entirely. While I had been studying the bones, he had been examining the inside of the ossuary lid. In a small carved recess that would have been invisible until the lid was removed, he had found a sealed clay jar no larger than my fist. "Daniel, look at this," he called softly. "Someone went to great lengths to hide this." The jar was perfectly preserved, sealed with a mixture of beeswax and tree resin that had hardened into an impermeable barrier. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of waxed cloth, was a fragment of papyrus covered in neat lines of Koine Greek text. "We need to get this to a specialist immediately," I said. "This could be the most significant manuscript discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls." Dr. Goldberg arranged for the papyrus to be transported to a specialized laboratory in Haifa, where it could be analyzed under controlled conditions. Dr. Moshe Goldstein, a papyrologist with an international reputation, agreed to examine it personally despite the weekend. While we waited for the analysis, Elias and I continued our exploration of the tomb complex. What we discovered in the smaller burial chambers added new dimensions to the mystery. Each of the 6 satellite chambers contained evidence of ritual activity, burned remnants of incense, small clay lamps that had been deliberately broken, and most disturbing of all, scratch marks on the walls that appeared to have been made by human fingernails. "Someone was trying to claw their way out," Elias observed, running his fingers along the deep gouges in the limestone. "These marks were made from inside the chambers, by someone who was trapped." The implications were staggering. If Jesus had indeed been buried alive in this tomb, had others suffered the same fate? Were these satellite chambers designed to hold other victims of this ancient conspiracy? Saturday night, I was staying in a small hotel overlooking the old city of Nazareth when I was awakened by an unusual sound. It was after 1:30 in the morning, and at first I thought I might be hearing the call to prayer from one of the local mosques. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were singing, not calling, and they were singing in Hebrew, not Arabic. I stepped onto the small balcony of my room and looked down toward the Church of the Annunciation. 3 figures stood in the shadow of the basilica, barely visible in the dim streetlight. One held what appeared to be a torch, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. The other 2 stood motionless beside what I knew was the entrance to our excavation site. The singing was hauntingly beautiful, a melodic chant in ancient Hebrew that seemed to drift up from the very stones of the old city. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elias appeared beside me on the balcony, his face pale in the moonlight. He had been awakened by the same sound. "Daniel, those aren't local residents or pilgrims," he whispered. "How can you tell?" "The dialect. They're singing in biblical Hebrew, not modern Hebrew. And look at their clothing." I strained my eyes in the darkness and could just make out that the 3 figures were wearing what appeared to be traditional robes, not the modern dress of contemporary Israelis or Palestinians. "Who are they?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene below. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of recognition, mixed with fear. "Samaritans," he said. "I've heard whispers about them in academic circles for years, but I never believed the stories were true." "What stories?" "That there are families among the Samaritan community who have maintained ancient traditions, ancient knowledge, for nearly 2,000 years. They call themselves the Keepers." "Keepers of what?" "The secret. The truth about what really happened to Jesus of Nazareth. The truth about why certain tombs must never be disturbed." By the time we made it down to the street, the figures had vanished completely, but they had left something behind that made my blood run cold. On the limestone wall beside the entrance to the church, someone had drawn a symbol in what appeared to be blood. It was a simple fish, the ancient Christian symbol, but it had been drawn upside down. The next morning, Sunday, we received the translation of the papyrus fragment from Dr. Goldstein in Haifa. His analysis confirmed that the papyrus was authentic, dating to the 1st century AD, and written in the style characteristic of early Christian texts, but the content was unlike anything found in the canonical Gospels. The text appeared to be a quote from Jesus himself, but it was a quote that appeared in no known Gospel, canonical or apocryphal. "He drank from the bitter cup and became man no longer. His return is not peace but separation. Those who would bind the darkness must become darkness themselves." The phrasing was apocalyptic, almost threatening. This wasn't the gentle Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount or the compassionate healer of the Gospel stories. This was something else entirely, something that spoke of transformation and separation rather than salvation and unity. But there was more. Dr. Goldstein's analysis revealed that the papyrus had been deliberately hidden, wrapped and sealed with the kind of care typically reserved for the most precious documents. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve this text while ensuring it would never be found by accident. That afternoon, I filed our preliminary report with Ararat Group headquarters through our secure communication system. I detailed our findings, the tomb's unusual orientation, the inscribed ossuary, the skeletal remains with evidence of crucifixion, and the hidden papyrus fragment. The response came back within 2 hours, and it was unlike anything I had received in 7 years of working for the organization. The message was brief, formal, and chilling. Priority Alpha Directive. Cease all excavation activities immediately. Seal excavation site completely. Return to Boston for immediate debriefing. Discuss findings with no one outside the organization. Acknowledge receipt immediately. The message was signed by Director Coleman himself, something that had never happened in any of my previous assignments. Elias was furious when I showed him the directive. "Daniel, we're on the verge of the greatest archaeological discovery in human history. We can't just walk away and pretend this doesn't exist." We don't have a choice, Elias. This is a priority alpha directive. If we ignore it, we'll be terminated from the organization and blacklisted from every archaeological institution in the world. But even as I said the words, I could see that Elias wasn't listening. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a kind of fevered intensity that worried me. "They're covering this up," he said, pacing around our small hotel room. "The church, the Israeli authorities, maybe even our own organization. They know exactly what we found, and they're terrified of it." "What do you think we found, Elias?" He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "I think we found evidence that the greatest story ever told was a deliberate lie. I think Jesus of Nazareth didn't die on the cross and rise from the dead. I think he was taken down alive, brought to that tomb, and buried there while still breathing." The implications of what he was suggesting were staggering. But why? Why would anyone do such a thing? "Because of what he had become," Elias said quietly. "Think about it, Daniel. The papyrus fragment talks about drinking from the bitter cup and becoming man no longer. What if the crucifixion wasn't meant to kill Jesus? What if it was meant to transform him into something else?" "That's speculation, Elias. We're scientists, not conspiracy theorists." "Are we?" After 34 years of working for organizations like the Ararat Group, I've learned that the line between science and conspiracy is thinner than most people realize. How many discoveries have we seen buried because they threatened established beliefs? How many artifacts have disappeared into private collections or church vaults? That evening, against my better judgment, I found myself back at the excavation site with Elias. He had insisted on taking one final set of measurements, one last look at the tomb before we sealed it forever. But as we descended into the burial chamber, I realized that Elias had brought more than measuring equipment. He had a small portable drill and several sample containers. "What are you doing?" "Taking samples they can't confiscate," he said, carefully drilling into the limestone, near the scratched inscriptions. "If they're going to bury this discovery, I want to make sure we have evidence." As he worked, I found myself drawn back to the central ossuary. In the beam of my flashlight, the bones seemed different somehow, more present, as if the act of discovery had awakened something that had been dormant for centuries. "Elias, do you hear that?" He stopped drilling and listened. From somewhere deep within the tomb complex came a sound like whispers, too faint to make out words but unmistakably human in origin. "It's just the wind moving through the chambers," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The whispering grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the tomb at all. It was coming from above, from the church itself. Someone was moving around in the upper levels, and they were not alone. We quickly packed our equipment and made our way back through the narrow opening. As we climbed the stone stairs toward the main level of the church, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more unsettling than the mysterious voices had been. That was the last time I saw Elias North alive. Monday morning, I woke to find his bed empty and his equipment gone. His passport was still on the nightstand, but everything else he had brought to Israel had vanished. I searched the hotel, called his phone dozens of times, and finally contacted the local police. The desk clerk remembered seeing him leave around 4:30 in the morning, carrying a large backpack and what appeared to be archaeological equipment. He had told the clerk he was going for an early morning hike in the hills around Nazareth, but I knew Elias better than that. He wasn't a hiker, and he would never have left without telling me where he was going. Just after noon, his phone pinged once with a location marker: Mount Gerizim, near the ancient Samaritan temple ruins, about an hour's drive north of Nazareth. Then the phone went dead completely. I rented a car and drove immediately toward the mountain, but within minutes I realized I was being followed. 2 black sedans maintained a perfect distance behind me, never getting close enough for me to see the occupants, but never falling far enough behind to lose sight of my vehicle. When I pulled into a gas station to refuel, both cars drove slowly past, their windows too heavily tinted to see inside. When I got back on the road, they resumed their position, exactly 3 cars behind me. I never made it to Mount Gerizim. Instead, I turned around at the next exit and drove straight back to Tel Aviv, packed my bags and booked a seat on the next flight to Boston. But the nightmare was just beginning. 3 days after I returned home, I received a call from the Haifa police. Dr. Moshe Goldstein, the papyrologist who had analysed our fragment, had been found dead at the bottom of his apartment building. The initial investigation suggested suicide, but his colleagues insisted he had been excited about a recent discovery, not depressed. I attended his funeral the following week, and afterward, his research assistant pulled me aside. "Professor Goldstein was very disturbed by something he found in your papyrus," she said quietly. "He spent the entire weekend researching similar texts in early Christian literature. The night before he died, he called me at home, very excited, saying he had found connections to other suppressed documents." "What kind of connections?" "He wouldn't say over the phone. He was afraid someone might be listening, but he asked me to tell you that if anything happened to him, you should look into the Gospel of Judas and something called the Sethian texts." When I returned to my apartment in Boston, I knew immediately that it had been searched. Nothing obvious was missing, but everything was slightly out of place in a way that suggested professional investigators had gone through my belongings methodically. My computer had been accessed and cleaned. The backup drives I kept in my home safe were gone, along with all the digital photographs and notes from our excavation. Even my handwritten journal had vanished. But the most chilling discovery came when I tried to access our file on the Ararat Group's secure servers. According to the system, no record of our Nazareth excavation existed. Our field reports had been deleted, our photographs erased, and our sample requests cancelled as if they had never been submitted. I was being systematically erased from the discovery. Over the following weeks, I tried to contact everyone who had been involved in our investigation. Father Antonio had been transferred to a remote monastery in the mountains of northern Italy and was not available for communication. Dr. Ruth Goldberg from the Israel Museum claimed no memory of working with us and insisted that the museum had no record of our visit. The excavation site itself had been sealed behind what church officials described as an emergency restoration project. When I called the Church of the Annunciation directly, I was told that no archaeological work had been conducted recently and that all lower level areas were closed indefinitely for structural repairs. It was as if our entire discovery had been wiped from existence. But I wasn't completely alone. Through carefully worded inquiries in academic circles, I began to find others who had encountered similar suppression. A professor in Munich who had been forced to retract a paper about inconsistencies in gospel accounts of the crucifixion. An archaeologist in Jordan whose funding had been mysteriously cut after she suggested that physical evidence contradicted traditional resurrection narratives. Most significantly, I made contact with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a religious historian at Oxford who had spent decades studying suppressed early Christian texts. When I mentioned the papyrus fragment we had discovered, her response was immediate and alarmed. "Mr. Hale, you need to understand that what you found is part of a much larger pattern of suppression that goes back nearly 2,000 years. The early church didn't just choose which gospels to include in the New Testament. They actively destroyed texts that contradicted their preferred narrative." "What kind of texts?" "Documents that suggested Jesus survived the crucifixion. Gospels that described him as becoming something other than human after his supposed death. Texts that warned about his eventual return. Not as a saviour, but as something far more dangerous." She agreed to meet me in London at a small cafe near the British Museum, where we could speak without being overheard. Dr. Chen was a small, intense woman in her 50s, with the kind of focused intelligence that came from decades of academic research. The fragment you described fits perfectly with a group of texts scholars called the Sethian Gospels, she explained over coffee. These were suppressed so thoroughly that until recently we knew of their existence only through references in the writings of early church fathers who condemned them. What made them so dangerous? They presented a version of Christianity that was fundamentally incompatible with the religion that eventually emerged from the Roman Empire. According to these texts, Jesus didn't die to save humanity from sin. He died to prevent something much worse from happening. She leaned closer, lowering her voice even though we were alone in the cafe. The Sethian text suggests that Jesus was transformed by his crucifixion experience into something that was no longer entirely human. They describe his followers as being split between those who helped him transcend his humanity and those who recognized that his transformation posed a terrible threat to the world. What kind of threat? The texts are unclear on the specifics, but they consistently describe his return not as the second coming promised in Orthodox Christianity, but as an event that would bring separation and darkness rather than unity and light. Dr. Chen reached into a briefcase and pulled out a folder containing photocopies of ancient manuscript fragments. These are from the Nag Hammadi Library and other collections of early Christian texts. Look at this passage from the Gospel of Judas. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. She pointed to another fragment. And this from a Sethian text discovered in Egypt. He who drinks from the cup of transformation becomes the door through which darkness enters the world. The similarity to our papyrus fragment was unmistakable. Dr. Chen, are you suggesting that there was an actual conspiracy within early Christianity to suppress the truth about what happened to Jesus? I'm suggesting that the evidence points to a group within the early church who believed they had a responsibility to keep certain knowledge hidden, not just from the general population, but from other Christians as well. She closed the folder and looked at me directly. Mr. Hale, if what you discovered in Nazareth is authentic, then you found physical evidence of the most carefully guarded secret in human history. And if my research is correct, there are people who will do anything to keep that secret buried. I returned to Boston, more convinced than ever that Elias and I had stumbled onto something that powerful people wanted to remain hidden. But I was also more frightened than I had ever been in my life. My apartment was being watched. I regularly noticed the same individuals in coffee shops, on subway platforms, and walking past my building. My phone calls were monitored, my emails read before I sent them, and my credit card transactions tracked in real time. But the dreams were the worst part of my ordeal. Every night I found myself back in that tomb beneath the church of the Annunciation. I would stand before the opened ossuary as the skeletal remains slowly turned their hollow sockets toward me. From somewhere deep in the limestone chambers, I could hear Elias's voice, no longer speaking English but chanting in the same ancient Hebrew I had heard from the mysterious figures outside the church. The dreams always ended the same way. The bones in the ossuary would begin to move, reassembling themselves into the shape of a man, but a man changed by whatever had happened to him in that tomb. And from the eye sockets that were no longer empty, something that had once been Jesus of Nazareth would look at me with an expression of infinite malevolence. Last Tuesday, exactly 3 months after Elias's disappearance, I received a single text message from his phone. It was the first communication since he had vanished on Mount Gerizim. The message contained only 7 words. He was not the lamb, he was the door. I knew then that Elias hadn't simply disappeared. He had found what he was looking for on that ancient mountain, and he had joined the keepers, the guardians of the secret that had been passed down through generations of Samaritan families. He had learned the truth about what we had discovered in that tomb, and the truth had changed him just as it had changed the figure whose bones we had disturbed. Yesterday I made a decision that I know will likely cost me my life. I drove to the offices of the Boston Globe and asked to speak with their religion reporter. I was going to tell her everything, show her the few photographs I had managed to hide from my pursuers, and let the world know what the church and other powerful institutions have been hiding for nearly 2,000 years. But as I sat in the newspaper's lobby, waiting for the appointment, I realized I was being watched by at least 3 different individuals. When I got up to use the restroom, I noticed that one of them followed me, maintaining a careful distance but never letting me out of sight. I left the building without speaking to the reporter. I understand now that there is no one I can trust with this information. The conspiracy to suppress the truth about Jesus of Nazareth involves not just the Catholic Church but Protestant denominations, Islamic authorities, Jewish religious leaders, and secular academic institutions. They are all part of the same ancient agreement to keep certain knowledge buried, because they all understand what I'm only beginning to grasp. Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. The Jesus we found in that tomb wasn't the gentle teacher of the Gospels. He wasn't the Saviour who died for humanity's sins and rose again to offer eternal life. He was something that the crucifixion had transformed into a threat so great that his own followers helped to bury him alive, facing away from the holy city, bound with iron nails and ancient curses. And for 2,000 years, different religious traditions have worked together to ensure that he remains buried. The papyrus fragments, warning echoes in my mind every waking moment. His return is not peace but separation. What if the second coming that billions of Christians pray for isn't the salvation they expect? What if it's the very thing that the early church died to prevent? I'm writing this final account from a cabin in the mountains of northern Maine, as far from civilization as I can manage. Tomorrow, I'm going to disappear, the way Elias did, the way Father Antonio did, the way Dr. Goldstein did. But unlike them, I'm not being silenced by others. I'm silencing myself, because I finally understand what we found in that tomb beneath the Church of the Annunciation. We didn't find the remains of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of mankind. We found the remains of something that wore his form, but had been transformed by forces that human understanding cannot comprehend. We found something that was never meant to return to the world of the living, something that the combined efforts of his followers, his enemies, and 2,000 years of religious tradition have worked to keep imprisoned in limestone and darkness. Something that has been waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to disturb its rest. If you're reading this, don't try to find me. Don't try to verify my story. Don't go looking for that tomb beneath the Church of the Annunciation. And whatever you do, don't try to contact the Ararat Group or any other organization that claims to investigate biblical mysteries. They already know what I've told you. They've always known. The real question isn't whether the tomb contains the remains of Jesus of Nazareth. The real question is whether those remains are still truly dead. 3 nights ago, I had the dream again, but this time it was different. This time, when the skeletal figure in the ossuary turned to look at me, it spoke. Not in ancient Hebrew or Aramaic, but in perfect modern English. "Daniel," it said, and the voice was unmistakably Elias's, though it came from a mouth that had been dust for 2 millennia. "You understand now, don't you? We didn't discover a tomb, we opened a door." I woke up screaming, but when I looked around the cabin, I wasn't alone. Standing in the corner, barely visible, in the pre-dawn darkness, was a figure I recognized, Elias but changed, wearing the traditional robes of the Samaritan keepers, his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. "It's time, Daniel," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Time to take your place among the guardians. Time to help us keep the door sealed." I'm writing these final words as the sun rises over the Maine wilderness. I can see them coming up the mountain path, a procession of figures in ancient robes, moving with the deliberate pace of those who have been walking the same path for 2,000 years. Elias leads them, no longer the mentor I knew, but something that serves a purpose far older and more terrible than archaeological discovery. Behind him walk others I recognize. Father Antonio, his face serene with the peace of terrible knowledge. Dr. Goldstein, alive but transformed, and others I don't know but whose robes mark them as keepers of the same ancient secret. They're not coming to kill me. Death would be a mercy compared to what they offer. They're coming to recruit me, to make me one of the guardians who ensure that certain doors remain closed, certain tombs remain sealed, and certain truths remain buried. I understand now why every civilization, every religion, every culture has stories of things that should not be awakened. We tell ourselves these are myths, folklore, superstition, but they're not stories at all. They're warnings. The Jesus of Nazareth, who died on the cross, was indeed resurrected, but not in the way the Gospels describe. He was brought back as something else, something that his closest followers recognized as a threat to everything human and holy. The early church didn't lie about the resurrection to create a religion. They lied about it to hide the fact that they had helped to imprison something that should never have been allowed to return. For 2,000 years, the keepers have maintained their vigil. Samaritans, Christians, Jews, Muslims, even secular authorities, all working together to ensure that the door we opened in that tomb remains closed. And now it's my turn to join them. I can hear their footsteps on the cabin's wooden steps. I can hear Elias's voice, no longer quite human, calling my name with the patient persistence of something that has eternity to wait for an answer. The truth about Jesus of Nazareth isn't that he was divine or that he was merely human. The truth is that he became something in between, something that transcended humanity but brought with it horrors that the ancient world recognized and feared. The second coming isn't a promise of salvation. It's a threat that requires constant vigilance to prevent. And I'm about to become part of that vigilance. If someone finds this account after I'm gone, remember what I've told you. Remember that some doors should never be opened, some tombs should never be disturbed, and some truths should never be spoken aloud. Remember that the greatest conspiracy in human history isn't about hiding the truth from us. It's about protecting us from the truth. The footsteps have stopped outside my door. I can see shadows moving past the windows, circling the cabin with the precision of a ritual that has been performed countless times before. Elias is knocking now, 3 slow, deliberate raps that echo through the mountain silence. "Daniel," he calls, and his voice carries the weight of centuries. "It's time to come home, time to help us keep the watch, time to ensure that he who was bound in limestone and darkness remains bound until the end of all things." I'm setting down my pen now. I'm walking to the door, not because I want to, but because I finally understand that this is how it has always been meant to end. The tomb beneath the Church of the Annunciation was never meant to be discovered by accident. We were led there, chosen for this purpose, selected to join the ranks of those who guarded the most dangerous secret in human history. The resurrection wasn't a miracle. It was a mistake that has required 2,000 years of vigilance to contain. And now that vigilance has a new guardian. I can hear them singing now, the ancient Hebrew chant I first heard in Nazareth, the same words that have been sung by the keepers for generation after generation. It's beautiful and terrible, a lullaby to keep something sleeping, a ward to keep something bound. The door is opening. Elias stands on the threshold, no longer my mentor, but something far older and more purposeful. Behind him, the other keepers wait with the patience of those who serve a cause greater than any individual life. "Welcome home, Daniel," he says, and in his transformed features, I see not horror, but relief. The relief of finally understanding why some knowledge must be hidden, why some truths must be suppressed, and why some doors must never be opened. I'm crossing the threshold now. I'm joining the watch. I'm becoming one of those who ensure that the Messiah's tomb remains sealed, not because we deny his power, but because we understand exactly what that power would bring to the world. Some saviors are meant to save us, and some are meant to be saved from. The chanting grows louder as I take my place among the keepers. 2,000 years of vigilance stretches behind us, and God willing, 2,000 more stretch ahead. Because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is the end of everything.